Hi, folks. I will do my best to share with you in 10 short minutes the key insights from my paper. My paper focused on the role of consequences in restorative practices. And my main interest was what does it mean to understand the social discipline window, the idea of doing things with our young people. Building on that, looking at consequences in school policies was a major focus in my paper and extracting insight for international schools like the one that I currently work on. How do we build meaningful policies for such international schools? Also, international schools, we deal with young people that have got unique social and emotional needs. The literature refers to them as third culture kids. And a third culture kid is essentially somebody who doesn't live in the country that they have the passport for. They don't live in their home culture per se. They're living in a culture that is not their own. And when they return to their home country, they often feel like they don't belong because they don't have a sense of being grounded in either of those cultures. So there's unique social and emotional needs that come with that I looked at in my paper. And of course, I used that to drive the idea that restorative practices are the best fit for international skills. But the central message of my paper was the idea that accountability is critical in restorative practices. But when restorative is done poorly, often we might end up going towards the permissive quadrant of the social discipline window. And the consequence of that, the result of that, is that restorative practices might be abandoned or might be criticized or it might be rejected by very pragmatic teachers who need policy, clear policy, to help guide them. So hence my focus being on providing clear policy. How do we do that? What constitutes good policy? And what are the insights we can take away? Now, the reason why I was motivated to do this is because I was in Spain over the summer. I was speaking to somebody who's a well-known restorative trainer and author, and we had a conversation about consequences. And it's a conversation that's come up over the years before. And in my paper, I mentioned this that this particular person told me she didn't believe in consequences. Now, my view was that I think what she meant is that she didn't believe in punishment. But our language is so important. And if you tell a teacher you don't believe in consequences, you are effectively disarming that teacher, and that has major implications for our understanding of the social discipline window and for restorative practices in general. So in my paper, I define what do we mean by consequence, how is it different to being punitive, and what does accountability mean? Because language is important in all of that. Again, go back to international schools. I did a deep dive into what do we mean by the social and emotional needs of these third culture kids I defined earlier on. And a couple of key points that came out that really stand out, I've highlighted in green, is the idea that personal relationships are so much more important to our young people in this particular international school than geographical location. So they find their identity through relationships. Likewise, when it comes to teachers, they actively seek and want teachers that build respectful and meaningful relationships. This is what the literature is telling us. Hence, restorative practices being such a good fit for international schools, which was another idea I was trying to drive in my paper. But returning to the idea of consequences, which is really important when crafting policy, um, I had the pleasure of looking at some of the theory and the historical ideas of the 20th century of Alfred Adler, who spoke about the need for a child to be, kind of in touch with themselves, and it's our job as teachers to do that. And then, of course, Rudolf Dreikurs, who spoke a lot about the role of logical consequences and preparing children for life, the idea of learning for life, which so many schools talk about. And as I looked deeper into Dreikurs, Dreikurs speaks a lot about a child's unmet need, how as teachers we should be looking beyond their behavior to what the unmet need is. And he spoke about avoiding punishment, but he did speak very clearly and very articulately about the importance of logical consequences are related to misbehavior that provide an opportunity for learning and growth. And that ties in with the 1990s, the rise of the positive discipline movement. So I looked at the work of Jane Nelson and how she develops the idea of logical consequences even further, the idea that they should be related to the incident, respectful to the child, and reasonable in their in the decisions we take for what constitutes a logical consequence. So discipline should not be about rewards, punishment, or control. We know this, and I felt this was important in restorative practices. Because if we are going to talk about whole school systems change, we need to be clear exactly what our policies are going to look like. And as I mentioned earlier, I was surprised by the lack of policies I could find online, um, which was a real disappointment to me. And the ones I did find really varied in quality. For a school that's looking to embrace restorative practice at the systems level, and we know that the literature suggests that this is the best approach, the best practice is to embrace it at the whole system level as opposed to just individual trainings. Although obviously we need both, right? We need quality training combined with a whole school approach. But we need to have clear, pragmatic policies, not policies that reflect just good ideas and ideals, but policies that teachers can be convinced by, policies that address teachers' concerns and criticisms. So this is what I was discussing in my paper. And some of the insights I took away from the schools, in fact, I reduced it to 3 schools, not to 4, because of space. But the best policy I found was Chicago's public schools guide and toolkit to behavior. And I think the reason why that was so good, and I analyzed this in my paper, was just the sheer volume of schools that they work with and the sheer number of people who could offer insight into this policy. It was incredibly well written, lots of wonderful insights, lots of pragmatism, and yes, it spoke a lot about logical consequences, which comes from responsive classroom, which I will speak about in just a moment. Perhaps the weakest policy I found was a school that did it in isolation. A school in the United Kingdom called Bell Lane Primary School. With all respect to the school, I found that because they worked as a silo, they didn't benefit from that wide range of perspective they could have done. So they didn't collaborate. And also, it begged the question, what constitutes a restorative school? Because they were claiming that they were doing restorative practices, but when I looked close at their policy, they still had detentions, they still had systems of rewards, they didn't quite embed restorative concepts with fidelity. So that was an interesting one for me to look at, and I spoke at length about this in my paper. And some of the key takeaways I took away as a teacher here in Kenya is that our sister school in Tanzania, a school that I've worked with, delivering restorative practice training to, they are looking to develop restorative models into their systems. And I actually realized that our schools could be working together as we do that based on the insights I took from my paper. Now, I mentioned responsive classroom because responsive classroom is a culmination of all of the ideas of positive discipline, from Jane Nelson to Dreikers to Adler, those theorists. And some of the key ideas in responsive classroom really, there's many, but the key one that I focused on was the idea of logical consequences. So I felt like restorative practices could learn a lot, or at least be informed by responsive classroom with its focus on logical consequence. And it develops our understanding of the concept of width from the social discipline window. What do we do when a student doesn't know how to respond to the question, what needs to happen to make things right? What do we do if a student's not engaging in good faith with us? At what point do we have to revert to logical consequences where the teacher has to make that decision for the child? Or at what point do we just say, well, whatever the child says is what we will do? That's a disempowering thing to do. And for those of us who work at the chalk face, we know that that can be manipulated by young people as well. Sadly, that is true. So we need to have that tension working with, but always the idea of logical consequences, a clear understanding in our minds of what a consequence might look like. And that should be clearly articulated through policy. So responsive classroom is excellent at this. However, I did do some contrasting, and essentially I noted that, hey, if we look at restorative justice, it can draw from multiple fields, as you can see highlighted in green. Responsive classroom doesn't do this. If we look at the literature, as you can see in beige, you've got many more results in literature when we research restorative justice than we do for responsive classroom. And also, responsive classroom is limited because it's a K through to 8 initiative, whereas restorative justice is for whole schools, restorative practices. So in my paper, I contrasted them and I looked for some insight, and I concluded that it's not that one is better than the other. That's the wrong question to be asking. It's not about creating this false dichotomy or the idea that one, it's mutually exclusive. It's about what can restorative practices learn from this kind of multi-tiered approach. And restorative practices can definitely learn a lot from responsive classroom in terms of the role of logical consequences, in terms of informing school policy and taking that deeply pragmatic approach. So that was a real key takeaway for me. And in terms of the implications, I found that the best behaviour policies, as mentioned, come from schools that work together. And that's really important. Yes, we want to contextualize for our individual unique schools, but equally, we need more exemplars out there, and we need to be collaborating when we are forming these policies. Obviously, training is important, but we need to have clear-cut policy in order to reduce the kickback from staff, the criticisms from staff, the claims that it's an easy, soft option. etc., etc. So this is something I discussed in depth in my paper. And in terms of international skills, some implications, because I studied the needs of the students, clearly I've argued that restorative practices meet those needs. But it's not just about the students. I also identified that teachers are coming from a range of nationalities, and not all teachers are coming from democratic countries, in which case we need to have clear policy in order to help these teachers understand what authority means in our institution. Because obviously that will be different to what authority might look like in their home country in terms of power, in terms of hierarchy. So policy is important for that because a restorative culture could be quite alien for somebody who's never experienced that in their home country before. So I felt like the most significant expansion of the field is to really dig into the idea of width. And in my conclusion, this is what I discussed, the idea of having insights into what does it mean to work with young people, and especially with international education. So I hope you enjoyed reading my paper. Thank you so much for listening, and I really hope I was able to capture the key ideas.